you're probably sitting there thinking, asking yourself, well, what exactly is the Gramsci Enigma? And I think Gramsci, of all the theorists in the Marxist tradition, has a set of ideas that often lend themselves to quite a lot of contestation and debate over what exactly what did Gramsci really stand for? What exactly is something, if you like, the real Gramscian tradition within Marxism? So, today's talk and discussion, I'm going to talk a bit about, we'll ask, well, is there a Gramscian tradition within Marxism? Or do attempts to establish a Gramscian tradition actually have to draw upon quite partial and partial readings and accounts of Gramsci's writings, and rather than looking, if you like, at the kind of more the totality of what Gramsci stood for? And so what exactly is the Gramsci Enigma? Well, Gramsci was taken up in the late 1970s and early 1980s by a lot of currents, particularly within the Italian Communist Party, do you want to, if everyone here moves along one, and then there'll be room for people to come in at the end. So Gramsci was taken up in the late 1970s by currents, particularly within the Italian Communist Party and Italian Communist movement, but also internationally, as really to be the theorist of reform within Marxism. And he was often held up as the person that understood the importance of a long-term evolutionary struggle to overthrow capitalism, rather than being the theorist that's often associated with the kind of decisive revolutionary conflict and the overthrow of the state, say people like Trotsky or Lenin. He was also at the same time taken up as a social scientist as part of the kind of turn towards the new left within academia, and often with someone within Marxism that overcame the perception that there'd been a vulgarization of Marxism that had presented it as an economically determinist and rigid social theory that didn't really capture the kind of complexity of social life in the reproduction and creation of human societies. And in particular, Gramsci was identified with the creation of cultural studies within the 1970s and 1980s. People like Stuart Hall, who's widely considered to be the founder of cultural studies, but who was also a Euro-communist, really promoted Gramsci as a theorist of the superstructure against the base. Now, what I want to argue is that there is no Gramscian tradition in the sense of a systematic body of ideas that Gramsci developed and defined himself that stood in contrast to other parts of the classical Marxist tradition. But what we do find in Gramsci's work, and that's not to say the kind of turn to Gramscian thought and ideas in the 1970s and 1980s wasn't valuable. I think a lot of it was valuable, and it wasn't just reformists who took up and promoted Gramsci's ideas. But what you can find in Gramsci is a set of insights and concepts that actually need to be situated as part of and an evolution of the classical Marxist tradition itself, both as a tradition of political economy, how you analyse changes in social structure and the role of revolutionary action within that social structure, but also as a strategist. And Gramsci has to be put in the context of his life and work. So in the 1920s, before his imprisonment, the overwhelming influence on his ideas were those of the international communist movement. Gramsci was a leader of the Italian Communist Party from the moment of its foundation, and he was also participated in the founding conference of the international communist movement, in founding conferences of the international communist movement, the first four, often referred to as the first four congresses of the Communist International. And these were the real influence on Gramsci's politics. Well, they played a decisive influence on Gramsci's politics and ideas. And often attempts to present Gramsci, certainly as a reformist, are compelled to lose sight of this revolutionary tradition that he forms part of, that Gramsci was a communist. He stood for the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of workers' governments based on the armed people that would proceed to the full abolition of capitalism on the world scale and the construction of a socialist future. So he very much should be situated within the tradition and politics of the Russian Revolution. Well, so what exactly was this context? Well, Gramsci was one of a number of people who saw in the Russian Revolution like a beacon of hope for all of humanity. And the Russian Revolution was what was taken up as a great moment of rupture in the old order, not only by people and Marxists who had, if you like, been preparing for that rupture in the first part of the 20th century. The Russian Revolution attracted a wide range of thinkers and currents from across the intellectual tradition, outside and often outside of the traditional parties of social democracy. And part of the reason for that is the split that had taken place in the social democracy in Western Europe in the first part of the 20th century, around the First World War, because many of the mass parties of the working class that had been founded in this period, founded as Marxist parties, actually supported the First World War and supported their governments pursuing that conflict. And so when radical-minded people were looking to the Russian Revolution, in a sense they saw it as a beacon of hope against a Marxist project that appeared to have failed in Western Europe, in the sense that it had been complicit in this terrible carnage. So anarcho-syndicalist currents turned to the Russian Revolution, and people like Gramsci as well, who were influenced by radical idealist kind of thoughts. Now, after the Russian Revolution, the Italian Socialist Party actually occupied a peculiar position in relation to other Western European Marxist parties, because the Italian Socialist Party, of which Gramsci was a member and supporter, never supported the First World War explicitly. So whereas many of the social democratic parties supported the conflict, it always stood opposed to it to a certain degree, not perhaps as much as some of us would have liked, but it was opposed to that conflict. And that meant when the foundation of the Communist International took place at the end of that war, after the Russian Revolution, the Italian Socialist Party actually affiliated to the Communist International. And after the Russian Revolution, there was a period of mass ferment and mobilisation across Western Europe, driven forward partly by the inspiration that the Russian Revolution provided for revolutionary activity thereafter, but also by the tremendous anger that the First World War had created in creating misery across Western Europe. And the Biennio Rosso in Italy was a key moment in Gramsci's own political evolution. This was often referred to as the Red 2 Years, and it saw a series of factory occupations take place up and down Italy, a period of intense social mobilisation and popularisation politically of the politics of the Italian Socialist Party. So at the high point of the Red 2 Years, in the Italian general election, the Socialist Party actually won the biggest proportion of the vote, over 30% of the vote. So there was a wave of factory occupations. And this context very much influenced the early development of Gramsci's Marxism, that he saw in the factory occupations the possibility of working class people harnessing the means of production, the means in the factories, and using that power to create the conditions for socialist transformation. L'Ordine Nuovo was a magazine of the left that Gramsci ran at this time and edited, that very much emphasised the revolutionary potential of the factory occupation movement. Now, it was within this context that the Italian Communist Party came to be founded. And I mean, I haven't got time to go into it now, but there were a number of conflicts between communists within Italy and the Italian Socialist Party and the Communist International over the foundation of the Italian Communist Party. And I mean, to cut a long story short, so to speak, there was always a strong tendency within Italian communism to ultra-leftism, and this was particularly identified with Bordiga, who Lenin actually criticises very heavily in his pamphlet Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. So there was a conflict between the Communist International and left-wing communism going on, of which Gramsci did not support the ultra-left wing of the Communist Party, but actually was the political leader that became most associated with the politics of the Communist International, at least after the foundation of the Italian Communist Party and after the third and fourth congresses of the Communist International. So at the same time, within Italy, after the Italian Socialist Party had really failed the revolutionary test of the Red 2 years, because this was a period of massive social mobilisation, huge factory occupations, but they weren't able to give a radical lead to forces within the working class movement and actually take steps to organise a seizure of power within Italy. It very much failed the test. And like many moments of revolutionary opportunity within the 1920s and 1930s, we saw a very, very serious negative consequence to that. The first emergence of fascism within Western Europe as a mass social mobilisation and movement that into the 1920s that intensified into the middle of that decade with the complete eventual closing down of liberal democracy. So that was one context for the evolution of Gramsci's ideas, the emergence of fascism and the failure of the period of mass mobilisation after the Russian Revolution and the First World War. And the second context was that Gramsci, for historical reasons, was in some ways less aware of. I mean, bear in mind he was imprisoned between 1926 and 1934. So this meant that in this period we get a very, very intense process of political degeneration of the Russian Revolution. This is where Stalin at the head of the bureaucracy really moved to close down the organs of working class democracy within Russia and create conditions that we became very, very familiar with from the 1930s onward, a bitter caricature of the revolutionary hopes that revolution represented and the consolidation of anti-democratic, authoritarian Stalinist regimes. Now, Gramsci couldn't be politically active, if you like, within the context of this close down. So he was, in many respects, isolated from the political argument and debate that took place as Trotskyism emerged as an alternative current to the degeneration of the Russian Revolution led by Stalin. And as I'll come on in a moment to say, I think that context of the timing, if you like, the sequencing of Gramsci's imprisonment has a very, very crucial influence on his ability to articulate and develop ideas. So many of the concepts he develops and becomes associated with are taken from his prison notebooks. So to run through, and that has a number of implications for the content of them, arguably. Now, to run through some of Gramsci's key ideas of which he's often associated with. Now, firstly, there's a vision of Marxism that Gramsci offers us that is in many ways quite distinctive and what makes Gramsci attractive. And there's this focus in the prison writings on what Gramsci calls the philosophy of practice. Now, but when he talks about the philosophy of practice, this is under the gaze of the prison censor. So when he's talking about the philosophy of practice, in many ways he's referring to what we would more commonly describe as Marxism. Yeah. So, but this is if you like, out of order in terms of the censorship of the time. But it actually, in the notion of the philosophy of practice that can be unpacked, there's a powerful opposition running through all of the prison notebooks to what might be called economism or determinist visions of Marxism. Because what he takes from Marx is the idea that human society should be studied through the practical reproduction of relations between the human species and nature. So there is this constant metabolic interchange in the course of human activity that reproduces class relations, but that takes place within the material context of the natural world. So, I mean, there is this powerful kind of dialectical thread running through Gramsci's work, because what he doesn't want to do is read off simply and in an uncontradictory way developments that take place within the sphere of politics from developments in the economic base. He sees the two existing in a constant state of mutual interaction with one another. There's also, in the prison notebooks, a real sensitivity to cultural and national differences. So Gramsci was very much influenced by the kind of Marxism that actually Trotsky kind of arguably pioneered with his notion of the uneven but combined development of capitalism. And this was the idea that when capitalism expanded, it did so not in a way of flattening out the rest of society to make it all look like the first capitalist states. So Trotsky's argument is that, well, when capitalism expanded globally out of Western Europe, it didn't just recreate what was already in Western Europe, but actually incorporated and integrated into capitalism old systems of social production and old class relations. So when Trotsky spoke about combined development in Russia, he was saying that a highly peculiar amalgam of social forms had come together. Now, this was something that this idea was very much a feature of Trotsky's argument at the third and fourth congresses of the Communist International, and it arguably had a profound impact on Gramsci's writings in the prison notebooks, because there's a real sensitivity to what Gramsci often calls the contradictory amalgams of combined development. And for Gramsci, he very much saw this develop within Italy itself towards the end of the 19th century, that we get this fusion of old land-owning elites that were juxtaposed to the rapid industrial capitalism of the north and became politically concentrated within the emergence of the Italian state. So there was this sensitivity to cultural and national differences. In addition, we have, and as part of that, we have this notion of the historical legacy that Marx left. So, in vulgar conceptions of Marxism, there's a sense in which what actually happens historically is not fundamental to the Marxist theory, because the theory, if you like, already, once you have the theory, then everything else is seen as just as an expression of what you already know. Now, for Gramsci, he was totally opposed to that vision of what Marxism represented. So for Gramsci, what occurs concretely requires concrete historical investigation in its own right. So there's a constant state of interaction between the articulation of the theory and the concrete historical circumstances within the historical materialist method. Now, lastly, there is, like Gramsci uses throughout the prison notebooks in terms of his vision of Marxism that he's offering, he often uses this word, the organic or organicity. Now, what he means by that in many respects, and again, you have to kind of decipher what exactly he's talking about, but often the sense is that when something is organic, or you're thinking of something as organic, you're taking concern to look at the totality of fundamental social relations and conflicts that are taking place with any moment. So this notion of organicity runs through the prison notebooks. And for Gramsci, when he talked about an organic crisis of the system, then it's a bit like the crisis that we see now in the global capitalism, that there's a sense in which it's a fundamental crisis of the whole system that is reflected both economically but mediated through a whole series of different political institutions. It's what Trotsky referred to as a historic crisis of the system as a whole. Now, in terms, like the idea that Gramsci is most associated with in some respects is this notion of hegemony that I'll come on to actually in just a moment. But I think but he also develops a few other concepts within the prison notebooks as well. There's lots of discussion about the relationship between the political party and social classes, how these exist in a state of constant interaction and mutual combination. And there is also a discussion that maybe I'll skip over for now for sake of time, of the war of position and war of manoeuvre. The war of position being a long-term process in which you try to create a hegemonic basis for socialist ideas within the working class. The war of manoeuvre being the point of revolutionary offensive and attack. And there is also, and tied into this question of hegemony, we have this notion of the historic bloc as well, uniting historic classes around an emancipatory vision of society, a socialist vision. Now, I just want to, how do we unpack in some ways the Enigma? Well, I'm not sure, you can discuss for a long time the question, well, what did Gramsci really think? But I think it's always worth bearing in mind that when lots of these interpretive controversies that have taken place over in Gramsci studies, if you like, often tell you more about the politics of the people who are contesting the controversy in the 1970s, 1980s, 2000s than they do about what Gramsci really think, in inverted commas. But what I want to really emphasise is really the profound influence of Lenin and Trotsky in the period where Gramsci was first formulating his revolutionary Marxist ideas, and the point of interaction between Italian communism and the Communist International. There's also the question that I've already mentioned of the nature of the prison notebooks themselves, on which all of these interpretive controversies are kind of based. There was a fascist censor looking over the texts, and he was imprisoned, and he wasn't there between 1926 and 34, and he wasn't therefore involved in the kind of hive of political argument and discussion and conflict that was taking place, or actively involved in the international working class movement. But methodologically, I think it's also worth mentioning an idea that informs all of Gramsci's work in the prison notebooks, and that's the idea of internal relations. Now, I haven't got time to go very much into this, but I mean, basically some of the criticisms that have been made of Gramsci is that he uses concepts inconsistently. So you'll find lots of references in the prison notebooks to the concept of passive revolution at one moment, and then you'll find it used in a very different context in another moment. Now, I think this inconsistency arguably does tell us about the apparent inconsistency tells us about the methodology that Gramsci is using, that he arguably very much shared with Trotsky in particular. And that's for Gramsci, when you're telling a historical story, the conceptual apparatus is kind of secondary to the historical narrative and story that you're telling. Kind of what happens is what matters is what happens when and why, and the concepts you use to explain this historical process are secondary to that narrative, but they also, when you use a concept in one way, it's internally related, if you like, to your other concepts. And this was arguably a key part of historical materialist method, the notion of totality, that no concept exists in isolation from other concepts, and all concepts find their historical justification in the extent to which they've been able to make profound explanations of the historical and social process. So lastly, I think the third and fourth congresses are really important in terms of Gramsci's political evolution, because at those conferences there was a real conflict within the Communist International taking place, which was basically how to respond to the decline of revolutionary mobilisation that had peaked and erupted after the Russian Revolution. So at the third and fourth congresses in 1921 and 1922, the Communist International, led by Lenin and Trotsky at the time, said that communists had to practice a policy of the united front towards the reformist working classes. That you shouldn't put forward. You should pursue united front of the whole working class, and through that process, you will be practical process. You will be able to expose the deficiencies of reformist politics and win more workers to the banner of revolutionary communism. And Gramsci was very much influenced politically by the debates around that Congress. And you could well argue that after 1922, his whole political kind of life is marked by him trying to interpret the decisions of that Congress and make them appropriate to the Italian context in particular. And basically part of I won't go into it too much. But actually, maybe we can discuss that more. I mean, there were big disputes and arguments within the Italian Communist Party over the decisions of the third and fourth congresses. Okay, well, I think here, when you come to some of Gramsci's ideas, the notion of hegemony and the party is so important. And I guess the reason I wanted to pick it out is that it really illustrates the profound influence that the Communist International had on his ideas. So, broadly speaking, like the notion of hegemony, as it emerged in the Russian social, in the modern context, emerged within Russian social democracy at the beginning of the 20th century, and it was used by Russian social democrats to describe the need for the working class, led by Marxists, to come to the head of the democratic revolution that was taking place within Russia at the time. And Gramsci, Lenin in particular, used this idea to describe how the working class in the big industrial centres of Russia needed to be able to bring behind it the radical peasantry to make a revolution. So in this context, we have the hegemony describing a kind of combination between consent, like you win people to your ideas, but also power, that you have to establish a state that reflected this hegemonic basis for society. And so hegemony presupposes a few things that very much influence Gramsci. Hegemony as a concept was originally taken from the arguments amongst the classical Greeks. That's where the Russian Marxists got it. And there it was used in contrast to archy, that just means power, that just means control. So hegemony poses this question of consent, of legitimate power. So we get this combination of consent and power that's really important to the concept. But it also presupposes this notion of interest, that actually you needed a political party that represented the class interests of the workers that it purported to stand at the head of. It also presupposes this question of trust and authority. So Gramsci talks about the Revolutionary Party as a party of persuaders, that you build a communist movement of Marxists that are able to have authority over the workplaces of the industrial working class. And this authority kind of presupposes a basis of trust, and the fact that the party does not simply impose its ideas monolithically on the working class, but exists in this kind of mutual state of interaction. In addition, Gramsci's notion of hegemony in the party was very much influenced by a broad notion of the intelligentsia. So Gramsci says in the prison notebooks that everyone is an intellectual. They're just not treated as intellectuals within class society. So his notion of the political party was radically egalitarian in many respects, taken from Lenin, in that he tries to establish a political party with real trust in authority, in which you had a rank and file membership that were capable of challenging the leadership of the party precisely because they were themselves intellectuals. They had this authority over the ideas of revolutionary Marxism. Now, Gramsci did extend and develop this concept that he took from the Russian Marxists, arguably quite significantly. But again, this reflects the influence of the third and fourth congresses of the Communist International. So Gramsci applies the notion of hegemony to international relations. He talks about how you can have hegemonic powers that stand at the head of the international system. And that's been a very, very popular aspect of how his ideas have been applied within international relations, for example. But he also argues that in terms of domestic class relations and how a state relates to civil society or the wider class structure, that there has to be a hegemonic moment for all ruling classes, that all ruling classes have to try to establish hegemony for their ideas if they are going to be able to effectively rule. So he uses this concept analytically as well to describe the relationship in a very general sense between the leaders and the led. So sometimes it refers to how revolutionary Marxists should use this idea in building parties with mass authority over the working class. But at other moments, he's using it analytically to describe how the stability of how capitalist society itself achieves its stability. And so for Gramsci, when he talks about organic crisis that I've already mentioned, there's a notion that there's a crisis of hegemony within society. So again, if you look at the organic crisis of today, the global financial crisis, that has this kind of over-determining impact on all international politics, we can see very much that there is a real crisis of hegemony at every level of society. There's a crisis of hegemony in international relations, in the sense that the dominant position of America over the global system is increasingly called into question. But there's also, as the Occupy Wall Street protests show, a crisis of hegemony for our own ruling classes. The ideas that have been accepted for decades are now openly called into question. So Gramsci's notion of the organic crisis reflects his Marxism in the sense that you see this interaction between the economic and superstructure is for Gramsci fundamental to understanding the whole totality. I also just want to flag up, I mean, it's like when the Euro-communists in the Italian Communist Party took up this idea, you know, it has to be borne in mind that you're talking about a highly Stalinized reformist party, and one of the ironies of Euro-communism was that they were, if you like, supporting the Soviet Union in the East while promoting very, very liberal politics within the West. But I think it's important to bring to light politically the anti-Stalinism that is fundamental to Gramsci's writings within the prison notebooks. So here's a discussion, a couple of quotes in the prison notebooks where Gramsci is describing the distinction between democratic centralism, legitimate authority, and the kind of bureaucratic centralism. And bear in mind, this was before the bureaucratic centralism of the Soviet Union had really consolidated itself and become a very visible feature in international politics. That Gramsci is describing this contrast between the democratic centralism of healthy revolutionary organisation and the bureaucratic centralism that became to dominate in the USSR. So, you know, he writes that organicity can only be found in democratic centralism, which is, so to speak, a centralism in movement, a continual adaptation of the organisation to the real movement, a matching of thrusts from below with orders from above. So we have here the kind of reciprocal understanding of an organicity, the positive kind of understanding of democratic centralism that Gramsci sees as this relationship of interaction between the rank and file and the leadership. And he goes on in the same passage to describe bureaucratic centralism in contrast, that the prevalence of bureaucratic centralism in the state indicates that the leading group is saturated, that is turning into a narrow clique which tends to perpetuate its selfish privileges by controlling or even by stifling the birth of opposition forces. And in a sense, this is, as a set of observations, very prescient for the kind of political decay that we saw take place within the Soviet Union, as you had a self-interested clique close down the opportunity for rank and file dissent in order to sustain their own narrow material and bureaucratic interests. Now, how does Gramsci then stand? I've emphasised a lot of the commonality between Gramsci and the ideas and method that was kind of pioneered, arguably, by Leon Trotsky. Now, I think there's definitely, with Gramsci and Trotsky then, how do we answer this question? Is it friends or foes? Well, we can definitely see this. They both shared this very, very sophisticated approach to historical materialism, a desire to recognise that the superstructure, the ideology, formed part of economic systems. So Trotsky, when he's talking very dialectically about the process of interaction between the material base and the political superstructure, he uses a nice formulation where he describes the tasks of the economic base being submitted for solution to the political superstructure. And his argument here is that, well, capitalism and capitalist economy poses certain questions for politics. And these are submitted finally to a kind of only can find their resolution at the sphere of the political. And so there's a sense in which class conflicts are kind of refracted into the political realm in this kind of irreducible form, and they're governed by this decisive logic of the struggle for state power itself. And if you look again to use this recurring example of the financial crisis, you very much see that. You can't understand the British economy today and its conjunctural and general development without factoring in the impact that the Conservative Party's austerity policy is directly having on the economic base, that then feeds back into the political by creating new challenges and tasks. And Gramsci says very similarly that fundamental conflicts appear to us at the level of ideology, at the level of consciousness. So he's arguing that, well, it's through our conscious political life, the superstructures we create, if you like, to make meaning of our own existence, that we become aware of the reality of class society itself. We only through politics and the ideology, in the ideological, can we come to be aware of this economic base. So both Gramsci and Trotsky share this kind of sensitivity to a sophisticated historical materialism. And indeed, if Gramsci had lived to see what the kind of historical materialism that was turned into a series of biblical shibboleths in the Soviet Union after the 1930s and the Stalinist takeover, where Marxist philosophy and thinking is vulgarised and turned into an instrument of oppressive political rule and domination, then I'm sure he would have been horrified at what that represented. And so there's definitely this common concern there. But Gramsci actually, in the prison notebooks, and this is the big kind of historical paradox in some ways, I mean, he appears to answer the friend or foe question very decisively, and he answers foes. So there's lots of references within the prison notebooks to criticisms of Trotsky. Now, basically, what I would argue that Gramsci is doing is that none of these criticisms given how sophisticated lots of the other arguments is, none of these arguments against Trotsky actually make very much sense, because what Gramsci accuses Trotsky of doing is simply not what Trotsky is doing or arguing. And in the course of the notebooks, basically Gramsci associates Trotsky with, I think I've already mentioned it, the theory of the offensive. And this was the idea that was actually most closely associated with Bukharin in the period after the Russian Revolution. And so it's the idea, really, to cut a long story short, of the task of revolutionary Marxism being to launch a kind of permanent insurrection against the capitalist state, a permanent state of war, a permanent offensive that doesn't take into account any of the difficult problems of developing a revolutionary socialist hegemony within the working class movement itself. Now, this arguably is simply not what Trotsky is, this simply is not Trotsky's position. And indeed, in the early communist movement, Trotsky was resolutely opposed to exactly this kind of statement. I think though that you can, there is a connection, because there's so much kind of to a degree of clear influence between Trotsky's writings after the in the course of the Russian Revolution and the prison notebooks itself. I would use the following distinction to draw out the commonality. Now, and that's in the notion of passive revolution that Gramsci uses. So Gramsci, when he's using this concept of passive revolution, he's using it to refer to the period in this last quarter of the 19th century, when ruling classes were having to carry through dramatic revolutionary changes to accommodate to the existence and consolidation of international capitalism. German and Italian unification are classic examples of this. But because capitalism had already developed and expanded quite significantly across this period, it had already created highly privileged elites within these countries that were basically opposed to the kind of outright revolutionary ruptures that Gramsci identifies as taking place in the French and American revolutions. And so what he argues is that there's actually a process of using very, very conservative methods and means to achieve the same historical tasks. That there's a sense in which there's a passive revolution takes place to consolidate and fit these states and regimes with the structural demands of international capitalism. Now, you could well argue that implicitly in Gramsci's notion of passive revolution, there's a contrast taking place with a very Trotskyist notion, and that's of the permanent revolution. And Trotsky's notion of permanent revolution was that the working class should come to the head of the Russian Revolution after establishing a social hegemony over the popular classes and proceed on to socialist tasks. I mean, the comparison, though, is complicated by the fact that in the prison notebooks, Gramsci does use the notion of permanent revolution, but he tends to use it negatively. So he refers to it as the 1848 formula becoming exhausted. And I would argue that what he's doing there, when he's using this notion of permanent revolution, he's saying that permanent revolution is exhausted for the bourgeoisie. He's not saying it's exhausted as a strategy for the working class. But certainly there's this common concern here of working class leadership, of socialist hegemony over the working class that is fundamental to the notion of permanent revolution itself. So to come to some conclusion, just to reiterate, I guess, the original thesis, I think there's no Gramscian tradition in the sense that there arguably is a Trotskyist tradition, in the sense that in Trotsky's struggle against Stalinism in the 20s and 30s, there develops a quite distinctive body of ideas and politics that stood in sharp contrast to the Stalinist degeneration of the Russian Revolution. I think it might not be a shock to people in this room, but I think it's worth emphasising, Gramsci was a Leninist and a communist. He stood for the creation of revolutionary parties, and given the popularity of Gramsci within the or degree of popularity and authority that Gramsci has within the social sciences, I think bringing to light the promotion of democratic centralism by Gramsci and the importance of party organisation at a time when there's an understandable hostility to these things in the Western world is worth doing in terms of regenerating a revolutionary Marxist project. And so lastly, Gramsci's critique of Trotsky, what do we make of it? Well, is it Gramsci's weaknesses? Well, we could see it that way, but we could also see it as Gramsci's tragedy in a sense. This was someone who was imprisoned in 1926 by a fascist regime, who became very ill, was released in 1934 and died an incredibly early death by 1937, that Gramsci's tragedy was that he was isolated from Trotsky and Trotskyism at the time when it was developing and becoming a systematic body of thought. And so it's a counterfactual argument, but we don't know how Gramsci's ideas would have been influenced by a more thoroughgoing collaborative relationship with Trotsky and Trotskyism. So I'll finish it there.
Thank you very much, Luke. Right on time. I'll open up to debate. We have slightly more than an hour, so I'll